Picture it. You've been invited on a stage. And this physical stage, you're going to have thousands of people out there in the audience. It's a great opportunity. Your ideal customers. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So how are you going to prepare? Will you say, I'll just wing it. I know my stuff. I'll just show up. No problem. Or would you prepare? Unfortunately, so many times when people go on targeted podcast interviews, they don't prepare. They don't respect the audience. They don't respect the podcast. And ultimately, they lose a great chance to get known, liked, and trusted by their ideal customers. The way they can grow their business and their brand. So today we're going to talk about how we teach and how you should prepare for a podcast interview. Now, a lot of this stuff we do for our clients, but just to save them time, but you can do it yourself. And there's really 3 pillars that I want you to think about with this. And so with this, the first one is listening to the podcast. I'm always amazed at the number of people that will go on a podcast cold, never listening to the podcast before. And you can spot it really quickly. They'll either mispronounce the host's name, or I can think of one. It was a daily podcast, one of the bigger podcasts, and John Lee Dumas used to ask the same questions to everybody. And there'd be this one of, what would you do if you woke up in a parallel universe? And I would just cringe when I would hear people say, you know what? I've never thought of that. It's like, you just told the audience, you're not one of us. You're a carpetbagger. You're just here for the interview. It lost all the credibility. So as you're listening to the podcast, listen for all of the factual things, but then listen for the undertone. There's a great book out there called Lingo by Jeffrey Shaw, Speak Your Customers' Secret Language. And it's so true. You're not just looking at the podcast description, but what do they talk about? And think about things like, their pace that they use. Do they talk over each other? Is it like a news show where they're talking over each other, or are they respectful of each other? That's very important. I always had heard Jerry Seinfeld could be hilarious anywhere he went, but he'd have to know whether or not he was talking to a bunch of nuns at a bingo convention, or if he was talking to a friar's roast, right? Content is king, but context is God. So make sure you know the pace, make sure you know the energy, make sure you know if it's a funny, humorous podcast, or if it's more factual. It can be very awkward. Another podcast, remember a gentleman going on and they started to ask him trivia. It was like a morning radio show format. And Mike Michalowicz did the show. Great show. But this gentleman got on there and they started to ask him questions on like Texas rock and roll, and gave him, 5 songs to say who it was. It was awkward. It was painful. He was surprised and he didn't look good with that. So make sure you have that understanding with it. Make sure after you listen to a few of the podcasts, then do some research. Go to their website, go to their blog, go to videos, find out what they're interested in, find out what they're talking about. You may go back to other guests and find out who else they have talked to. And the whole idea with this, with listening to the podcast, with doing the research, the goal is, the third thing is to find common connections, find common references. Because when you get up on that stage, you want to know who the audience is, what they talk about, what their inside jokes are. You want to come in as one of the group, not some carpetbagger that just is there for a transaction. And let me give you an example here. I mentioned Jeffrey Shaw before. He's got a podcast called Creative Warriors. Great podcast. One of the inside jokes is whenever he goes off on a tangent, sometimes he'll just say squirrel. Now, if you have no idea as a guest what he's talking about, it's going to throw you for a loop. It's the reference to that movie Up, where the dog Doug would just stop what he was doing when he got distracted by a squirrel. Well, if you want to fit in with that audience, you be the one to make the joke, right? When you find yourself going down a tangent, you make the joke. That will resonate so much. Other ones is to find places not to go. There's podcasts out there, and if you know what the host likes, you can go toward those areas and stay away from other areas. So here's an example. Another great podcast, Follow Your Different with Christopher Lochhead. Great podcast. On their brief sheet, when we tell clients of what to talk about, what to stay away from, one thing to stay away from is golf. Christopher's not a big fan of the game. He's not a big fan of people who play the game. If you make a reference to golf, you're likely to get a 3 to 5 minute rant on why he thinks golfers are wankers and it's a waste of time. Don't go there. You don't want to. So with that, be prepared. You've got a great opportunity. As a podcast guest, you're introduced to their audience. Make sure you know who that audience is so that you can come and you can perform. One final warning here. Podcasts are wonderful. They're evergreen. They're out there forever. That's the good news. And that's the bad news. If I went to a live event and I stood up there on stage and I embarrassed myself in front of, 50, 100, maybe 200 people, the only people that would really see that are those people in the audience. If you go on a podcast and embarrass yourself, well, maybe the host will be nice and not air it. But if you're one of those people that jump on a podcast and answer that question of, I never thought about that, and you show up unprepared, that's going to live throughout time. People are going to hear that over and over. So take podcasting seriously. If you want to get great results with it, do the work beforehand. If you can't do the work, hire somebody to help you do that work. You've got great opportunities. Exposure brings opportunity. Make sure it's the best opportunity for you. Has obscurity become your biggest problem? Stages have disappeared. Conferences are canceled. In-person meetings seem like a distant memory. Your prospective customers still need you. They still need to hear from you. Stop trying to break through the noise. It's not working. Get in on the conversation. Get featured as the expert guest on targeted podcast interviews. Podcasts are hot. Listenership is up 20% in 2020. Podcasts are the new digital stage. Leverage other people's established platform as a featured guest. Since 2015, Interview Valet has helped over 500 leading brands get featured on over 20,000 podcast episodes. You're the guest. We take care of the rest. Stop being the best kept secret. Find out how we can help you leverage targeted podcast interviews to get heard, to grow your brand, to grow your sales, to be recognized as the market leader.